The dining room at Haworth House was warm the night it happened. Warm in the way that great houses manage in the depths of January when the fires have been laid since morning, and the air itself seems to press close and hold its breath. 14 candles burned in the central candelabra above the long table, and their light fell on crystal and silver and the composed faces of 8 dinner guests, and on the decanter in Cecily Ashmore's hands. She had been told what was in it, not in those words. Peregrine never used direct words if an implication would serve. He had come to her in the anteroom an hour before the first course, his voice arranged into something that resembled concern, and he had told her that the brandy was prepared for Lord Halworth's particular constitution, that it had been altered by an apothecary of his acquaintance, that she was to serve it after the port, and before the guests withdrew, and that she was to ensure Lord Halworth received the first glass, and drank it before it was offered to any other gentleman at the table. He had smiled when he said it. He had said, "You are the companion. You do what you are told." She had said nothing. She had stood in the anteroom while the sounds of the arriving guests moved through the walls of Haworth House, and she had pressed her thumb against the spine of her father's prayer book, which she carried always in the pocket of her plain gray gown, and she had understood precisely what she was being asked to do. Now she stood at the end of the table with the decanter in her hands, and Lord Julian Carew, Viscount Halworth, sat at the head of it, and the candlelight fell on the strong line of his jaw and on his hands where they rested still on the white cloth, and he was watching her. Not as the other guests watched, with the idle attention of men whose glasses were nearly empty. He was watching with the particular quality of attention she had noticed in him since the first week of her service in this house. A careful, unreadable stillness, as though he were solving something that had not yet fully presented itself. She set the decanter down on the sideboard. It made a small sound, glass against wood. No one at the table turned. Lord Halworth did not move. Something shifted in his face, something so controlled that she could not have named it. Except to say that it was not surprise, it was something older than surprise. She met his gaze. She held it for 1 breath, 2, 3. And then she turned and walked from the dining room. And behind her the conversation resumed, as though she had never been there at all. She had been in service at Haworth House for 11 weeks by then, engaged as lady's companion to Lady Sophronia Crail, the widow who kept permanent rooms at the east end of the house, and who managed, through a combination of social authority and polished condescension, to treat the household as her own. It had not been Cecily's design to come here. It had been Peregrine's design, executed with the patience of a man who understood that desperation, given enough time, would accomplish what pressure could not. Her father had died in the summer, leaving behind a curacy no one else wanted, a rectory that reverted to the parish, and debts of a size that Cecily had not known about until the solicitor read them aloud in a room that smelled of old paper and finality. £340. Accumulated over 17 years of small generosities that the Reverend Mr. Dawes Ashmore had been constitutionally unable to refuse, among them loans to families in the parish who could not manage the winter, a new roof on a widow's cottage, medicines for children whose fathers had gone to the war and not returned. He had never told her. He had pressed her hand instead, in his particular way, and told her that she was worth more than the world had yet managed to discover. And she had believed him because she had not known the alternative. She had been worth nothing to the world immediately following his death. She was 24 years old, without portion, without connections of consequence, and with a distant cousin by marriage who had materialized from London within a fortnight of the funeral, to remind her in his particular style of careful sympathy of the extent to which she depended upon his goodwill. Peregrine Ashmore was 41, well-dressed and possessed of a confidence that Cecily had always found difficult to locate the foundation. He was not wealthy. He was not clever. He was present, and she was not. And the law arranged itself around presence with a thoroughness she had not fully appreciated until it was arranged around her. She had been given 1 month to remove herself from the rectory before the parish required it for the new incumbent. He had spent that month writing 6 letters to 6 women whose families she had known in the neighborhood of Weyham inquiring whether any position might be found for a woman of her education who could read in 4 languages, manage household accounts, play the pianoforte to a respectable degree, and carry a conversation through an entire evening without recourse to complaint. 4 letters went unanswered. 1 returned with regrets. The 6th was from a woman who had known her mother and who wrote with an apologetic warmth to say that she had heard of a position, though it was not in the neighborhood, and that the woman engaging a companion was Lady Sophronia Crail, of whom the writer knew little except that she was a widow and kept a good house. The position at Haworth House had come through Peregrine's arrangement with Lady Sophronia. The connection between them was vague in the way Peregrine's connections tended to be, and the arrangement had been presented to Cecily as generosity, while containing, she understood later, the precise mechanism of his scheme. Haworth House sat adjacent to a small property in the village of Barrow Lynd, the ownership of which had been disputed for 2 years between Peregrine's branch of the family and the estate of a deceased uncle, whose affairs Lord Haworth administered as executor. The resolution of that dispute had been pending before a solicitor in Bath for 14 months. The resolution, in Cecily's present understanding, would never reach Bath if Lord Haworth were to suffer a sudden and unfortunate decline. She had arrived at Haworth House on the 2nd of October, with a trunk that was not quite full, and a small leather case that contained her books, her father's prayer book among them, and the 6 letters she had received in her life that she had judged worth keeping. She had stood in the entrance hall while the footman carried her trunk upstairs, and she had looked at the high ceilings and the pale winter light coming through the tall windows and the orderly grandeur of a house that had been built by people who expected to live in it for generations, and she had felt, for the first time since the solicitor's office, something that was not grief and not fear. She did not know what to call it. It was perhaps simply the specific sensation of standing in a place that had not yet decided what to make of her, which felt, after everything, like a form of freedom. She had not known this when she arrived. She had learned it in fragments, the way one learns most things in a great house, through overheard words and the particular silences that follow them. Lord Haworth himself she had expected to find cold. His reputation in the neighborhood held him as a man of few words, fewer smiles, and an almost architectural self-containment that other men sometimes read as arrogance, and women of the county had long since given up attempting to soften. He had inherited the viscountcy 3 years ago from an elder brother, and with it a house he had not grown up in, obligations he had not sought, and a grief that the county did not discuss in his presence. Lady Sophronia discussed it in his absence with a relish Cecily found distasteful. The late Lady Haworth had been dead 2 winters past of a sudden illness, at a house party in Wiltshire, leaving no children, leaving Julian Carew with a face that had, in Lady Sophronia's phrase, gone to stone. What Cecily found, in practice, was not a cold man. She found a man who had built cold as a fortification, and who maintained it with the vigilance of someone who understood what had cost him when it cracked. She saw the crack first in the library, in the 2nd week of her employment, and it was not directed at her. She had come to return a volume she had borrowed from the upper shelf, the one concerning the natural history of the English countryside that she had been reading in the evenings when Lady Sophronia did not require her company. She had not expected to find the library occupied. Lord Haworth stood at the far window with his back to the door, and in his hands was a small prayer book, worn at the spine and soft at the corners in the way of objects handled daily over many years. She watched him for one unguarded moment, long enough to see what his face was doing when he believed himself alone. Something that was not grief, because grief implies movement, implies the possibility of arriving somewhere beyond itself, and what she saw in him was still, as though he had decided that stillness was the only defense against something that had not yet finished with him. She set her book on the table and left, without speaking. And he had not turned. He had noticed her after that, in the way that people notice an object they had not thought to look at, and cannot subsequently stop seeing. Not intrusively. He was incapable of intrusiveness. His attention was quiet and particular, a turning of focus that she would not have been able to describe to anyone else because it expressed itself through what he did not do rather than what he did. He did not dismiss her when she entered a room. He did not address his remarks exclusively to Lady Sophronia. In the East Parlor one morning when Lady Sophronia's conversation turned towards Cecily's father's debts, with the particular delicacy of someone who wished to wound while appearing merely to inform, Lord Halworth had set down his teacup and introduced a new subject with a flatness that closed the previous one entirely. He had not looked at Cecily when he did it. His shoulder had been angled ever so slightly toward her, the way a man stands when he is positioned between something and a source of discomfort. She had read it as protection. She had then told herself she had imagined it, because a woman in her position could not afford to read things that were not there. There were other moments she catalogued and refused. A morning in the gallery when she had stopped to look at the portrait of his elder brother, the previous Viscount, and had not heard him approach, and had turned to find him standing 3 feet away in the quiet of the high-ceilinged room, watching her face, rather than the portrait with that careful attention, and she had said, flustered, that she hoped she had not intruded, and he had said, without inflection, "You could not intrude here." She had not known what he meant, and had not asked. She had felt warmth travel from her collar to her jaw, and she had pressed her thumb against the prayer book and noted to herself that the gallery was narrow and that proximity explained everything that needed explaining. An afternoon in the estate room when he had been going over accounts with his steward and had looked up as she passed the open door and said, "Miss Ashmore," and she had stopped, and he had looked at her for a moment in silence as though something had been about to form itself into words, and had then changed its mind, and then he had said, levelly, "The East Parlor is warmer for reading. The morning room loses the sun after 2 o'clock." She had thanked him and gone to the East Parlor, and she had sat there with her book in her lap, and her heartbeat, louder than was justified by the information she had just been given. There was the evening she had played the pianoforte for Lady Sophronia's guests, a duty she performed without pleasure since the instrument was somewhat out of tune, and the pieces Lady Sophronia requested were pieces Cecily had been required to practice to a level of exhaustion at age 15. She had played them correctly. When she finished, the brief applause came from the guests, and Lady Sophronia said something gracious and dismissive in the same breath, and when Cecily rose from the bench and turned, Lord Halworth was standing beside the doorway, and his expression was not the polite social surface he maintained for the room. It was something else, something specific and unguarded, and when he saw that she had seen it, he looked away, and the surface returned, and she stood beside the pianoforte and understood that she had witnessed something she was not supposed to witness, and that she would not speak of it, and that this was already a kind of compact between them. Unspoken and entirely real. She had read it as protection. She had then told herself she had imagined it. She had told herself this in diminishing good faith. By December, she had mostly stopped believing herself. If you have stayed with this story until now, you will already have begun to understand what she could not yet permit herself to understand. Keep listening. The incident in the East Passage happened on the 3rd of January before the dinner, before Peregrine arrived with his careful voice and his altered brandy and his instruction. Peregrine had come to the house on the pretext of visiting Lady Sophronia, and he had found Cecily alone in the passage outside the morning room, and offered her £20, which was a great deal of money to a woman without portion, if she would sign a letter he had prepared stating that Lord Halworth had made improper advances toward her. She had looked at the envelope. She had looked at Peregrine's face, which was arranged into a rehearsed expression of fraternal concern. She had said, "No." Peregrine had said that £20 could become 40. She had said, "I have heard your offer and I am refusing it. I would like you to leave the passage." "If you please." He had left. What she did not know, and could not have known, was that Lord Halworth had come from the morning room at the sound of voices, had paused at the half-open door, and had heard every word of the exchange. He had heard Peregrine's voice and the amount he had named, and the purpose for which it was being offered. And he had heard Cecily refuse it with a composed directness that contained no appeal to his authority and required no rescue. And he had stood at the door for a moment, after Peregrine's footsteps retreated. And then he had gone back to his correspondence, and what had shifted in him was not something he could have named yet, but it had the quality of a thing that was preparing to be named. She had pressed her thumb against her father's prayer book, and breathed and told herself that Peregrine would attempt something else, because men like Peregrine always attempted something else, and that she must be ready. She had been raised by a man who believed that preparation was not the same as fear, and that courage was not the absence of clear sight but its direct product, and she held these beliefs in the passage, until her hands steadied, and then she went back to Lady Sophronia's sitting room, and resumed her afternoon as though nothing in the passage had occurred. That evening, passing the study door, she heard Lord Halworth's voice within, speaking with his steward, and she heard him pause mid-sentence, and she knew by the quality of the pause that he had heard her step in the passage. She did not stop. She continued to the east parlor, and sat with her book and her fire and the particular steadiness of a woman who has decided without yet being able to say the whole of it, that she is on one side of something and not the other. She had not been ready enough. The weeks between Peregrine's visit, the night of the dinner, were quiet in the way that a room is quiet in the minutes, before someone speaks a thing that cannot be unsaid. Lord Halworth was in residence. The house ran with the measured efficiency of a well-ordered establishment. Lady Sophronia received morning callers and directed Cecily through the social calendar with the precision of someone who understood that a companion's usefulness is best demonstrated through invisibility. Miss Octavia Featherstone came twice to dine, once with her mother, and once alone. She was very beautiful and very assured, and she sat beside Lord Halworth at the table, in the way of a woman who has been told all her life that she is the correct choice and has arranged herself accordingly. Cecily served the tea. She returned the cups. She was the companion, and the room had arranged itself around that fact without needing to say it aloud. Lord Halworth had said on the second of Miss Featherstone's visits, as the ladies gathered their wraps in the entrance hall, "Miss Ashmore." She had stopped. He had said nothing further for a moment, looking at her with that particular quality of assessment. Then he had said very quietly, "You are not warm enough for the hall. Go back to the parlor." He had said it as a command. She had heard it as something else entirely, something her body understood before her mind constructed the correct reasons not to understand it, and she had walked back to the parlor with her face composed and her heartbeat in her throat. She had told herself it was nothing. He was considerate of the staff. She was not the staff. She was not quite a guest. She occupied the liminal position that the Regency had constructed for women of good breeding and no fortune, and she occupied it with the dignity that her father had raised her to demonstrate in all circumstances, and she had pressed her thumb against the prayer book and reminded herself that dignity was not deliverance. It was in the 5th week that he told her about his wife. Not directly. He would not have known how to do it directly. The fortification did not permit it. It was in the library again, in the evening, when she had come to exchange her book, and found him at the writing table with letters he was not reading. She had gone to the shelf. He had said, without looking up, "Did you know her?" She had said, "My lord." He had said, "My wife." She grew up near your village. Her father was rector of Waham. She had said she had not known the family. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said in a voice that had been flattened by effort into something that resembled neutrality, "She died at Wiltshire, at Sir Geoffrey Prain's house. There were 16 guests, and she was well at dinner, and by morning she was not." He paused. His pen moved once on the paper without writing anything. The physician said, "Fever." "It was very fast," she said. Carefully, "I'm sorry." He said, "I have thought for 2 years that fever is a very general word for a very specific event." He set down the pen. He did not look at her. He said, "Forgive me. I do not know why I have said that to you." She stood at the shelf with her book in her hands, and she thought that he had said it because he needed to say it to someone who would receive it without judgment or calculation. "And I am here, and you have been watching long enough to understand that I am neither." She said nothing of what she thought. She said, "You need not apologize, my lord," and she left, and she carried what he had told her, the way she carried her father's prayer book, close, and with great care and with the knowledge that it mattered. She understood, walking back through the passage, that he suspected something about his wife's death that he had never been able to prove, and that this suspicion had been the architecture of the 2 years that followed, and that Lady Sophronia's presence in this house, and Peregrine's acquaintance with Lady Sophronia, had just assembled themselves in her mind into a shape she did not wish to look at directly. She looked at it directly. She stood in the passage outside her room and looked at it, and then she went inside and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and held her father's prayer book in both hands, and thought for a long time about what a woman in her position could and could not do. 2 days before the dinner, she found what she needed. She had not been searching. She had been engaged in the ordinary business of her position, carrying Lady Sophronia's correspondence to the morning room when she passed Peregrine's room and heard, through the door, the sound of Peregrine's voice and another she did not immediately recognize. The door was not quite latched. She did not stop. She continued 4 paces down the passage, and then stood against the wall and listened. And what she heard was Peregrine and Lady Sophronia discussing, in the specific language of people who have moved past the stage of metaphor, the exact quantity of a substance procured from an apothecary in Bath, and the manner in which it was to be introduced into Lord Halworth's brandy, and the document that would subsequently be signed attesting to a history of poor health. She pressed her thumb against the spine of the prayer book until she could feel her own pulse in it. She returned to Lady Sophronia's sitting room and said nothing. She served tea. She read aloud from a novel Lady Sophronia had indicated, a chapter and then another, her voice steady at the exact pace Lady Sophronia preferred, her mind arranged in the careful, separate way she had learned to manage since October, one part of it fully present in the room, attending to what was required, and another part working the problem that could not be worked aloud. She had learned this doubling in the rectory, sitting with her father in his last months, keeping her face composed for him while her heart moved separately through its own country. It was, she understood, the most useful thing that grief had given her. She returned the novel to its shelf. She helped Lady Sophronia with her correspondence. She carried 2 letters to the hall table and a third to the footman to be taken to the village. At first light she noted as she did these things that Peregrine had gone from the house. She noted that Lady Sophronia seemed in unusually good spirits at supper, a small lightness beneath the polished surface, the particular ease of a person who has made a plan they believe to be sufficient. She noted everything. She said nothing. She did not go to Lord Halworth, not yet. She had no evidence that could be held and read. She had her word against Peregrine's and Lady Sophronia's, and she was the companion. And she knew precisely what the companion's word was worth against 2 people of established social position and collective confidence. She had heard Lady Sophronia say at a dinner the previous week, with the casualness of someone who had said the same sentence many times and expected to say it many times more. Oh, the companion will see to it. The table had absorbed this without response, because that was what tables did with sentences of that kind, and Cecily had removed the empty dessert plates and understood with perfect clarity that her word was not the instrument that would serve here. She needed witnesses. She needed evidence that could not be dismissed as the distressed fabrication of a poor clergyman's daughter whose cousin wished her gone from the household. She went instead to Mrs. Dent. The housekeeper had her room at the back of the ground floor, near the still room, and she was there when Cecily knocked, sitting at her small writing table with the household accounts open before her and a single candle burning at her elbow. She looked up, and then she looked at Cecily's face more carefully, with the steadiness of a woman who has managed 30 years in a great house and knows the particular quality of face that precedes a difficult conversation, and she set down her pen and closed the accounts. Cecily sat in the chair across the table. She told Mrs. Dent exactly what she had heard through the door, and exactly what the brandy contained, and exactly what she intended to do about it, and exactly what she required. She did not rush through any of it, and she did not ask for comfort, and she did not pretend that the situation was less serious than it was. When she finished, she folded her hands in her lap and waited. Mrs. Myriad. Dent listened, without interruption. When Cecily finished, the housekeeper was silent for one long moment, looking at the closed accounts on the table between them as though some of what she needed to say was written there in the columns. Then she said, "Lord Halworth has trusted no one in this house since he came here." Cecily said, "I know." Mrs. Dent said, "He trusted his wife, and she died." A pause. Something passed across the older woman's face that was neither softness nor hardness, but the specific gravity of a person who has been carrying a thing alone for a long time and has recognized at last someone it can be shared with. "I did not like Lady Sophronia when she first came to this house. I do not think I was wrong not to like her, and there are things about the manner of Lady Halworth's death in Wiltshire that I have kept in my own mind for 2 years, because I had no proof of them, and no one I trusted to receive them." She looked at Cecily directly. "I think Lord Halworth suspects as I do. I think it is why he looks as he does," Cecily said carefully. "What you are asking me to do will require 2 other witnesses from the household," Mrs. Dent said. "Yes, and a solicitor who is present in the room and can confirm the matter before a constable is sent for." A pause. "Thomas will stand. Mrs. Parr will stand. I will speak to them tonight. And Mr. Gillard, the solicitor from the village, has acted for Lord Halworth in the property matter with your cousin. He is a man of principle. I will send a note to him tomorrow evening, so he can be present at the dinner," Cecily said. "Thank you." Mrs. Dent looked at her for a long moment with the measuring attention that Cecily had felt from her first week of employment, and then she said, "Thank you, Miss Ashmore." She said it plainly and without elaboration, in the voice of someone who means it, without needing to explain why. The night of the dinner was the 4th of January. Cold and still. The grounds of Halworth House, white with frost and the candles burning high in every room where guests moved through the warm air and spoke of ordinary things. Peregrine arrived with Lady Sophronia's evening party as though he were simply a guest. Miss Featherstone came on the arm of her mother. Lord Halworth stood at the head of the drawing-room and received them with the composed courtesy that cost him, Cecily knew now, considerably more than it appeared to cost. She had been given the decanter by Peregrine's own hand in the anteroom. She had carried it into the dining-room. She had stood at the end of the table with the candlelight above her, and she had looked at Lord Halworth, and she had set the decanter down. What happened next happened quickly. Mrs. Dent entered the dining-room through the service door. Thomas and Mrs. Parr came with her. Behind them, pausing at the threshold with the particular expression of a man who had been sent for and has arrived prepared, was Mr. Gillard, the solicitor from the village, whom Mrs. Dent had dispatched a note to at 6 o'clock that evening. Cecily said in the voice her father had raised her to use when she believed something to be true, "My lord, I must ask the company's patience. There is something in this room that requires your attention." Lady Sophronia made a sound that was the beginning of a sentence. She did not finish it. Peregrine rose from his chair. Lord Halworth said very quietly to Peregrine, "Sit down." Peregrine sat. The dining-room became very still. The candles burned. The frost pressed at the long windows. Cecily kept her hands at her sides, her left thumb against the pocket where the prayer book sat, and she told them what she had heard. She told them in the specific and ordered way her father had taught her to present a difficult truth. The words first, then the evidence, then the witnesses. Mrs. Dent confirmed what she had said. Thomas confirmed the time at which he had seen Peregrine in conversation with the apothecary in the stable yard 2 days prior. Mrs. Baybury confirmed that she had been sent from the anteroom by Lady Sophronia, specifically before Peregrine's conversation with Cecily about the brandy. She did not say she was afraid. She was afraid. Fear, her father had also taught her, was a condition to be felt and not to be obeyed. Miss Featherstone had gone very pale. Her mother had risen from her chair and was looking at Lady Sophronia with an expression that contained, Cecily thought, a very old and very specific recognition. Several of the other guests had turned away from the table entirely, as though by doing so they might separate themselves from what was being said. Lady Sophronia said, in the voice of someone who has never in her life had reason to doubt the sufficiency of her own authority. This is the companion speaking. She is a poor clergyman's daughter, without standing. Without. Lord Halworth said, "That is enough, Lady Sophronia." His voice was level. It was not loud. Something in it was not the reserved politeness of the previous 11 weeks. It was something stripped of its fortification, something that had been waiting behind the stone surface of him to be said, and the room heard the difference. He stood. He was not a small man, and the dining room knew it in that moment in the way that rooms know such things. He looked at Peregrine, who had gone the color of old plaster, and he said, "You will remain here until Mr. Gillard has taken your statement. You will not go to the anteroom. You will not go to your carriage. You will sit in that chair." He looked at Lady Sophronia. He said, "You and I, Lady Sophronia, have known each other for 3 years, and I have housed you in this establishment as an act of courtesy toward my late brother's arrangements. I am ending that arrangement. You will have your rooms cleared by Friday." Lady Sophronia opened her mouth. Lady Sophronia closed it again. Her fan, which she had been holding at its customary polished angle, had come down an inch, and then another, and she held it against her skirt now, like something she had forgotten was in her hand. Lord Halworth turned. Then, and he crossed the room, and he came to stand before Cecily Ashmore. The room was watching. All of it was watching. Miss Featherstone and her mother, and the other 7 guests and the 3 members of the household staff, and Mr. Gillard at the threshold. And the candlelight fell on his face in the way that candlelight falls on a face when it is finally done what light is meant to do. Find the thing that had been in darkness. He said, "She is not the companion. She is the woman I intend to marry." 12 words. Level certain. Irrevocable. He did not say them to the room. He said them to her. She heard her own breath. He said lower, so that only she could hear. "Cecily," her given name, the first time, in his voice. "Will you give me your hand?" It was not precisely a question. It was a command of the sort she had come to understand, the kind that functioned as protection, wearing the grammar of authority, and she had learned in the weeks of watching him that he did not know another way to extend himself past the fortification, and that it cost him more than it appeared, and that the cost was in itself the answer to the question she had spent 11 weeks refusing to ask herself. She took his hand. The room received this in the way that rooms receive such things when the thing being delivered is true rather than performed, with a collective stillness, and then with the beginning, cautious and not yet complete, of something that resembled relief. Mr. Gillard came forward. He took the decanter. He would later send for the constable from the village, and would produce in due course the documents attesting to what had been purchased and by whom, and what its intended recipient had been meant not to survive. Peregrine Ashmore did not leave Halworth House that night by his own choice. Lady Sophronia left the dining room with her back very straight, and her fan finally stilled at her side, and she did not speak again that evening to anyone. Miss Featherstone and her mother departed with the other guests within the hour, quietly, with the particular grace that well-bred people summon when they need to be elsewhere, and Miss Featherstone, pausing at the entrance hall, looked at Cecily once, and what was in her face was not what Cecily had expected. It was something that looked for just a moment, like a woman who has been relieved of an expectation she had never chosen. 3 weeks later, in the morning room at Halworth House, Lord Halworth sat at the writing table with his correspondence, and Cecily sat across from him with a book she had taken from the upper shelf of the library, and the fire in the grate spoke quietly to itself. And outside the long windows the January frost had finally given way to something softer. Something that was not yet spring, but was the first suggestion of its direction. She was not in the precise sense employed here any longer. She was engaged to be married to the man across the table by special license, in a ceremony that was to take place at the end of the month, in the village church, attended by Mrs. Dent and Mr. Gillard, and Thomas, and Mrs. Somery, pair and 2 friends of Lord Halworth's. From his time in the north, men who had the look of people who had been somewhat astonished by developments and were making their peace with the astonishment, The house had been quiet since Lady Sophronia's departure. The rooms that had been hers were aired and emptied. The furniture returned to its original arrangement, and something in the quality of the air throughout Holworth House had changed in a way that Cecily noticed most clearly in the evenings, when the passages were still and the fires were lit and the house seemed to have exhaled, after a long time, something it had been holding. She was reading. He was reading. The fire was warm. Occasionally, the soft shift of a log settling in the grate interrupted the silence between them, and neither of them found it necessary to fill that silence with anything other than what it already contained. He said, without looking up from his letters, "The prayer book." She said, "My lord." He looked up then. He said, "You carry it in your left pocket. You press your thumb against it when you are deciding something." A pause. The careful quality of his attention, full on her face. "Was it your father's?" She said, "Yes." He was quiet. Then he said, "I would like, if you will permit it, to have a copy made for your use, properly bound, before the wedding, so that you have one that is yours, and one that was his." She looked at him. The morning room was warm, and the frost was leaving the window. And she thought of her father's voice reading aloud to her in the rectory kitchen, and of the particular instruction he had given her on the subject of worth, and of the world's verdict, and the world's verdict's limitations. She said, "I would like that very much." He looked at her for a moment longer. That specific, attentive stillness that had never been indifference and had always been its precise opposite, and then he returned to his letters. Outside, the frost was melting on the stone window ledge. Drop by drop, quiet and ordinary, and entirely certain. The ground stretched pale and still beyond the glass. The same grounds she had arrived at in October, with a trunk that was not quite full and no particular expectation of what she would find here. And they looked different now, in the way that a place looks different when you have decided that it belongs to you and to the life you are going to live in it. In her pocket, against her thumb, the worn spine of the prayer book held its warmth. If Cecily's courage has stayed with you, leave a thought in the comments. Thank you for remaining until the end.